Okay, so I think first thing here, which most of you have already noticed, right, is that I have moved the date for the annotated bibliography to tomorrow. So you have one extra day to get that done. So if you have it done but you're not happy with it, or you don't have it done yet, you have a little bit of extra time, right? You're also, for Tuesday, going to complete assignment 1 on page 238 of writing analytically, but we're going to start it in class. It's going to be 500 words total, right? Also, next time is our last class meeting before finals period. So we're just going to go to the computer lab and we're going to write, right? So it's the same one down the hall where we worked for paper 1, right? So it's room 210. So does anybody have any questions about anything?
You said next Tuesday we're doing that.
Uh-huh.
After that, if our paper gets submitted before like Thursday, are we able to just, do we have to come to class still?
Yeah, because we're going to be doing, like, the paper you submit is going to be a draft, right?
Okay.
And then, yeah, I am going to want everybody to come for a peer review during the finals period. The peer review probably won't take the full 2 hours, right? Y'all can leave when you're done.
Will that be on Thursday?
I think it's on Thursday. Let me quickly check. It is on the syllabus. And I've got to get to the damn syllabus. Okay, so let's see. The peer review session is going to be Thursday the 9th from 10:30 to 12:30.
From 10 to 12?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm supposed to go home later on that because I have something for the Coast Guard on the 10th, so I was just making sure.
Okay, yeah. This will be on the 9th, 10:30 to 12:30. And like I said, we probably won't need to stay the whole time. Okay, any other questions about anything that's coming up? Okay, then what we want to work on today, right, is what to do with these sources once you've got them. Right, so this is actually one place we're going to, like, sitting as you're working with chapter 8 of writing analytically open next to you is probably going to be helpful to you, right? Because there are a lot of good pieces of advice in here for working with sources. But yeah, there are a couple of things, a couple of kind of general principles that I've put up here that we're going to talk a little bit about, and then I'm going to let you start getting to work on this assignment here, right? This is why I wanted you to bring the 2 sources to class with you today. So the first thing,
Can I ask you something?
yeah, go ahead.
How come that says that the annotated bibliography is due tomorrow?
Because I decided to give you an extra day.
Okay, because last night I saw it was due tonight.
Yeah,
Okay.
it was, but I decided to give you all a little extra time. Yeah. Where was I? Right. Okay. So, first thing to note when you're working with sources, right? The absolute first thing you want to do is suspend judgment while you're reading, right? Don't worry about agreeing or disagreeing with anything when you're still in the phase of just trying to understand the arguments, right? Save that for later. But yeah, when you're doing your research, this should not be your main concern, right? Just suspend any agree-disagree impulse until after you've considered all of the sources, right? Now, when you are writing, you are going to want to quote your sources directly in order to analyze, right? Now, you're going to want to quote relatively sparingly, right? You don't want to quote enormous chunks of text. And you want to quote small things that are kind of indicative of your source's thinking, right? The other thing that you want to make sure you're doing is, as we were talking about a moment ago, making sure that you are hooking the quote to your own language in some way, right? So instead of just dumping the quote into the middle of the paragraph, right, avoid these unanchored, unmoored, floating quotes, what you're going to want to do is start with a little preamble of your own, right? So, say, you're, like if I'm writing a paper on, I don't know, Irish poetry, and I quote, the critic Thomas Kinsella, I might say something like, Kinsella argues that Yeats's poetry is concerned with, I don't know, like something like, say, feminine beauty, right? And then I insert the quote after the colon there, right? And then explain what I take the quote to mean and how I'm going to apply it to what I'm working on, right? So quotes should always be kind of sandwiched in this sort of way, right? First, this is who I'm taking the quote from and what the general context of the remarks is. This is the quote. This is what I'm going to do with this quote, right? This is how this applies to what I'm trying to do. So that kind of gets us to step 2 here, right? Explain why you think the source means what you think it means and how it helps you. You're also going to want, like, instead of, like, there's often a good bit of temptation to either cram all your sources into the beginning of the paper or to save them for the end. Don't do that. Use them and analyze them as you go, right? If you're arranging your paper point by point to make certain arguments, right? I'm going to make this argument here, I'm going to make this argument here. Use the sources at the points at which they're most appropriate, right? This is the way to integrate them into your own argument rather than just using them either as setup or afterthought. You don't want that to happen. The other thing you're going to want to do too, like remember that you're not just using sources to provide answers to questions you're asking.
It's to ask more questions.
Exactly, it's to ask more and better questions, right? One thing that the sources will help you do is figure out what kinds of questions people ask about this particular text or this particular subject, right?
So you're basically saying sources aren't more of an answer, they're the opposite, they're more of a question. Instead, we use them for a question, not an answer.
Yeah, and what the source is trying to do is really kind of the same thing you're trying to do, right? They're coming up with a question about something they're looking at and trying to answer it as best they can with the evidence.
And then we further answer it?
Yeah, exactly. Don't just use their answer as the answer, right?
Yeah.
Try to build on that answer if you can. Or, even like feel free to question the answer they come to, right? It's like, well, this is what this person decided, but I think there's actually something else going on here. I'm going to show you an example of how to do that in a moment with some of my own stuff here. Another thing you're going to want to try to do, and this is one of the hardest things to do, right? But I want you to make the attempt. That's what the assignment we're going to be working on in a moment is going to be focused on. You want to remember that the academic world is pretty small, and that most people who work on the same subject, if they don't know each other personally, they at least tend to know each other's work, right? So, for example, most of the work I do is on a Northern Irish poet by the name of Louis MacNeice. MacNeice is a niche interest. There are maybe 4 or 5 other people who publish primarily on MacNeice. We all know each other. We all go to the same conferences and sit on the same panel and review each other's articles, right? Now, in most cases, the scholars you're reading won't actually literally know each other quite that well, right? But they are aware of each other's work and each other's arguments, right? So keep that in mind as you're reading. And what you might want to try to do is imagine how they would respond to each other, right? So you've got your little summary of source A's argument here, right? Okay, like this is what source A says about my topic. You put it next to source B's summary. And you think about, okay, how might they respond to each other, right? Where do they seem to agree? Where do they seem to disagree? And where can I intervene here, right? What might I be able to do to resolve any kind of discrepancy in this conversation, right? Do I see something that I think they're both missing, maybe? Do I agree with one more than the other? Do I think they're both completely out of it? And so these are the 6 major steps you're going to want to follow as you're trying to put together an argument with sources. Now, like I said, I've got some examples here that I'm going to give you to show you how some of these things are done, right? And I'm not going to argue that my examples here are necessarily the best examples. They're just what I had easily to hand.
So don't critique your work.
What's that?
Don't critique your work.
You can absolutely critique my work. My work is not above reproach. But I had this lying around, and I can at least explain what the thought process was. Right? If I'm giving you someone else's work, I can't necessarily explain to you what that person was thinking. These also illustrate a couple of different approaches to working with a source. So the first one I want to take a look at is the Tolkien essay here, right? The what a lot of things you do use good morning for. And there's 2 sides because there are 2 things I want to try to point out here. So the part I've got here in brackets, right? So in the individuated Hobbit, Jung, Tolkien, and the Archetypes of Middle-earth, Timothy O'Neill claims that the Gandalf of the Hobbit is, quote, merely an old conjurer with much dignity who could not bear looking ridiculous. The implication in O'Neill's description is that Gandalf is somehow ridiculous. And indeed, despite his capacity for getting his friends out of the occasional scrape, he is often clownish. Much of the humor in Tolkien's characterization of the wizard comes not from his actions, or, as O'Neill would have it, affronts to his dignity, however. It comes instead from Gandalf's frequent soliloquies on the ambiguities of spoken language. In his approach to language as an ever-shifting play of signifiers in which the signified is never quite stable, Gandalf pioneers an approach to the analysis of language that would be taken up 30 years later in the late 1960s by Jacques Derrida and his deconstructionist acolytes. So you don't necessarily have to understand anything about deconstruction here, right? But can you see what I've done with this particular source?
You use it as like a question to like explain a lot more from it. Kind of.
Yeah.
I kind of do it.
Yeah, so I'm using the source as a jumping off point, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, here's something this guy quotes. Here's a quote from this guy that I don't quite agree with. So I'm using that as a place to make my own point, right?
From it, yeah.
Yeah. Now, another thing you might want to try to do is group some of your sources together. If you've got sources that seem to be talking from very similar, if you've got, say, like 2 groups of sources that seem to be talking from similar perspectives that are opposed to each other, right? And that's what I've got an example of here on this one, the McNeice, Ireland, and Pastoral essay here, right? So again, if we're just looking here at what's in the brackets, right? So the first paragraph, much recent criticism of Louis MacNeice's work is focused on its Irish dimension. Specifically, it has attempted to solve the problem of where, or indeed whether, to place MacNeice in some canon of other of Anglo-Irish or Northern Irish poetry. Irish critics have paid particular attention to the question of MacNeice's nationality, which has been something of a vexed issue throughout the poet's career and its afterlife. Critics and poets of nationalist inclination like Tom Paulin, Declan Kuyburn, and Thomas Kinsella have tended either to exclude MacNeice altogether, as Kinsella famously banished him from his New Oxford Book of Irish Verse, or to damn him with faint praise, as Kuyburn does in Inventing Ireland, in which he wrongly associates MacNeice with the ascendancy and casts him as a critic of Ireland, both north and south, calling down a plague on both houses. Paulin, meanwhile, calls him the man from no part, whose poetry of modern urban life often resembles a commercial jingle. While these statements are meant to be complimentary to MacNeice, they nonetheless suggest a poet of surfaces whose engagement with issues of Irish regional identity is at most limited. MacNeice fares little better with English and American critics. Samuel Hines, for example, refers to MacNeice as a professional lachrymose Irishman. Such assessments of MacNeice treat his attitude towards Ireland and his poetry as unitary. The whole of the island is the same to him, and he rejects everything to do with it. So, can you see what it is I've tried to do here with these different sources? How is this working? What's the logic here?
It's the quote brings up a point and you answer it. Or brings up a question and you answer it.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, I'm using the quote to ask a question, right? I'm in some cases here pushing back against a quote when I think that the critic is wrong, right? For example, where I see like this other critic, Declan Kuyburn, has made what I think is an actual historical mistake. I point that out.
So you're arguing against a lot of them.
Yeah. So this is I'm using them to develop a position to push back against, right? This idea of Ireland is all one thing to Louis MacNeice, right? And then in the second paragraph, I'm doing the pushing back, right? I've picked up a second set of critics whose own origins and cultural identity are closer to MacNeice's, and using them to help formulate the argument that actually what's going on here is a lot more complicated, right? So these are I've got all of the examples here in brackets on these sheets, right? Or to give you a notion of the kinds of things you can be doing with sources and with quotes, particularly if we're thinking about them in terms of this conversation analogy, right? So what I would like all of you to start doing now is that exercise on page 238 in writing analytically, right? The making sources speak to one another's exercise. So you're going to we're going to take the two articles that I asked you to bring along for today, right? And you can use your phone or your computer to access them, because I get that having the printouts is impractical. And in 500 words, right, summarize their positions briefly, and then try to imagine what they would say to each other, right? Would they agree? Where would they agree? Where would they disagree? And don't try to put yourself into this yet, right? That's the big thing I want to stress here, right? You're not intervening in the conversation here yet. Right now, just kind of let them talk to each other. And so we'll use the rest of the period for this. You can get started on this. If you happen to finish it, great. Type it up when you get home, upload it to Georgia View. Right? It'll be due on Tuesday. But yeah, I will be here to answer any questions you have or to help you, right? Yeah, Chris.
The two sources that I have nothing to do with each other whatsoever. Because I'm doing
Okay.
our very last reading that we did.
The Terry Tempest Williams? Okay.
And so the two sources that I have, one is about the nuclear testing sites
Okay.
in that time in Utah and stuff, and their effects on the land of their the radiation spreading and stuff
Uh-huh.
like that.
Fallout,
And
yeah.
Yeah. And then my other source that I have is about women feeling stronger after beating breast cancer.
Okay.
She feels like a warrior and stuff. So those are the two that
Uh-huh.
I have no idea how I could.
Okay, well, you know, so there does seem to be, you know, maybe a kind of like strength and weakness or strength and vulnerability connection there, right? So that might be something you can kind of pick up and try to play with, right? So just, you know, look at the two of them together and see if you can find something like that. So it may not be an obvious connection, but yeah, just, you know,
Try to see what I
yeah,
can.
try to see what you can do with it. Brandon, did you have a question as well?
Yeah, so basically what you wanted to do is like make a short argumentative essay, right? But like suspend our judgment completely from it.
Yeah, I want you to suspend your judgment. Or yeah, you're not really talking about you're not really pushing your own argument here yet, right? What you're trying to do is explain these two sources arguments, right? Your two sources arguments, where they link up with each other, and what they might say to each other, right? If you put them into conversation with one another. Yeah, James.
Okay, so I have two that would work really well together, but I had to request one of them. So
Okay.
I don't actually have it with me right now. But can I still, I know what it's about. So can I still write on it and then add quotes later?
Yeah, that's fine.
Both of them don't have to be stuff that we've already like read, right?
No, what you should be using are secondary sources that you've got from the library databases for your paper.
Because originally when I've been like, I have a board at home that I've been putting together ideas for that paper. After we read MLK's letter from Birmingham jail, I was putting ideas together from both his letter and the letter that he was given, that he
Okay.
wrote in response to.
Okay.
Am I able to do that still, or is that?
Yeah, no, yeah, you can look at those as part of the same piece, yes.
Okay.
And in fact, that's actually not a bad model for thinking about sources conversing with each other, right? Because that's a piece that's written directly in response to something else.
So I can use those two as my two sources, or am I looking for another source?
As
on
your
top?
primary source, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you're still going to be, for this exercise, looking at two secondary sources that are talking about letter from
Okay.
Birmingham jail, not letter from Birmingham jail itself.
Okay.
And maybe I assume too much here as well. Let me just quickly take the temperature of the room here. Does everybody understand the distinction between a primary source and a secondary source? Okay, I usually assume that people have done this in 1101, but so primary source is the specific thing you are examining. Right, in this case, a text. So for you, the primary source would be letter for Birmingham jail, right? A secondary source
Would be something about that.
yeah, or anything that you're using to try to illuminate or explain that, right? Yeah. So it wouldn't have to be something that's specifically about letter for Birmingham jail. It could be something that's about, you know, the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, right? It could be something about Cold War America generally, right? It could be, you know, anything that helps you better understand what's
So
going on in letter
I
for
could
Birmingham
use
jail.
like other stuff from like the civil rights movement, like other, not necessarily like I was gonna say stories, but like other historical events that we learn in school in relation to like civil rights movement. kind of
What
thing.
would probably be better if you're using books and articles about the civil rights movement. That would be a more appropriate secondary source for that kind of
Would
assignment.
Britannica work?
What's that?
Britannica? Would that work?
No encyclopedias.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, generally speaking also, guys, if y'all have a question about whether or not a source is appropriate, feel free to ask.
When you get to the GSW library page, or is it?
You have to go to, you can't just tap on library because it shows it doesn't exist. You have to go to the academics tab on the website, and then under academics, it will say library. It's weird, look up.
Yeah, we made it real easy.
I make that mistake every time. So I see
Yeah.
library, like I know it does it, but
Yeah.
I don't realize it.
I have-
think about it.
I have real strong opinions about the new website.
So it drives me insane.
Well, all I will say is it was designed with marketing and advertising in mind, not with ease of use for people who actually work or study here.
How do you think that's about? Like, on the Florida community colleges, of course.
Since
The
they have
website
Spanish
literally
prices.
crashed 3 times a day,
Uh-huh.
and nobody would be able to use it. It was awful.
So when I'm at work here and people ask me questions on the phone, I'm like trying to find it, and I'm like,
Uh-huh.
I finally find it, I'm like, okay, now I gotta backtrack to figure out what I clicked to find the thing so I can tell them.
But everybody's got it now, right? Okay.